Dear students, as we have discussed in the previous class, our analysis of the aggregate labor supply and labor demand functions enables us to construct the classical aggregate supply curve. The classical aggregate supply curve. And aggregate supply curve is the macroeconomic analog to microeconomic concept of the supply curve of a firm. From our microeconomic courses, it is known to us that supply curve of a firm is the marginal cost curve above average variable cost. And for a firm, the supply curve gives different levels of output corresponding to different prices. That is the relationship between price and quantity supplied. And for a perfectly competitive firm, profits are maximized when MC is equal to WI by MPL, as we have discussed earlier. Also equal to MPL, I is equal to W by P. These two equations are identical from our derivation in a previous class. For an individual firm, money wage is assumed to be given when it decides the optimum output to supply and the optimum quantity of labor to hire, to purchase. For a firm, competitive firm, money wage is given when it decides the quantity of labor to purchase and the optimum quantity of output to be produced, because a competitive firm by assumption is a price taker. So, for a firm, money wage is assumed to be fixed and the supply curve is positively sloped. P is constant as W is constant, and as such there is a positive relation between price and quantity supplied. As price increases, quantity supplied increases because real wage decreases. Because higher P means lower real wage, so firms demand more labor and produce more output. But when we construct the aggregate supply curve for the economy as a whole, we cannot assume that money wage W is fixed, as output and labor inputs are varied. We can assume that W is fixed in the context of an individual firm, but this is not true for the economy as a whole. This is because when output and the amount of employment varies, money wage also varies. So, money wage W must adjust to maintain equilibrium in the labor market. This is the only difference between the supply curve in the microeconomic firm level and aggregate supply curve. In the context of a firm, aggregate supply curve is upward sloping because as prices increases, with the W remaining constant, W by P decreases and more workers will be employed. When the economy as a whole is concerned, W will not remain constant as more employment and more output is produced. So, with this difference, the aggregate supply curve addresses the same question as microeconomic analogy. The same question as microeconomic analogy. That is, how will level of output supplied vary when we change the product prices? How will level of output supplied vary when we change product prices? The classical aggregate supply function has this shape. The shape of the classical aggregate supply function is like this. This is AS, aggregate supply function. Level of output is YE, P1, 2 P1, 3 P1, like this. P1, 2 P1, 3 P1, etc. When P is equal to P1 and W is equal to W1, P is equal to P1 and W is equal to W1, from this graph, the level of output is, the level of employment is LE, and the corresponding output that we have derived earlier is YE. Now, the question is, how will the output vary when P is equal to 2 P1, that is double the initial price? When P is equal to 2 P1 and if money wage remain at W1, as we have seen, labor demand increases to L2, money wage, labor demand increases to L2, but labor supply decreases to L1. So, there is an excess supply of labor given by L1, L2, and as a result, money wages will increase. There is an demand for labor, and as there is an excess demand for labor, money wage will rise. In the classical model, money wage is assumed to be perfectly flexible. The process is something like this. As prices increases from P1 to P2, firms will respond by expanding and they try to expand the level of employment and production. And to increase employment, they have to attract workers from other firms because the economy is in a state of full employment. LE is full employment level of employment. So, as a result, they raise money wages, and as such, when money wage increases, then what happens is, as money wage increases, when price level increases to P2, 2 P1 equal to P2 or double P1, the real wage is again restored at 2 P1 by 2 W1 by 2 P1. Again the level of employment is LE. So at 2 P1 level of employment is again LE and output is YE. The same analysis if a price becomes 3 P1. There is an excess demand, there is competition between firms bid up prices until real wage is again restored at W by P and LE, and corresponding level of output is YE at 3P1. Now what happens here is, as price increases from P1, 2P1, 3P1, etc., only the level of output will remain constant at YE. That means in the classical model, aggregate supply curve is vertical. Now, having discussed the nature of aggregate supply curve, we also consider the factors that will not affect output and employment in the classical model. Since output and employment are supply determined, aggregate demand has no effect on output. Since output and income, employment are supply determined, level of aggregate demand has no effect on the economy. So factors such as quantity of money, level of government spending, demand for investment goods, etc., these are all demand side factors which will not affect equilibrium level of output and employment. And here one point is, the question is how prices increases from P1, 2P1, 3P1, etc. This we will see in the next session. An increase in the supply of money increases price level from P1, 2P1, 3P1, etc. But supply equilibrium level of output is not affected. That is a point which we will discuss later. So factors such as quantity of money, level of government spending, level of demand for investment goods, these are all demand side factors and it will not affect equilibrium level of income and output. But if there is a change in the tax rate, it is a supply side factor and it will affect equilibrium level of output and employment. That is a point which we will see later. So, the striking feature of classical model is its supply determined nature of output and employment. This property follows from the vertical aggregate supply curve. And aggregate supply curve is vertical because of the assumptions which we made about the labor market. And to conclude, the classical model of labor and product market is characterized by what is known as auction market. Classical labor and product market is characterized by auction market. What is meant by auction market? It means labor and output are assumed to be traded in markets that are continually in equilibrium and in which all participants make decisions based on announced real wage rates and product prices. That is the auction market characterization. Decisions are based on announced real wage and price and the market is continuously in equilibrium. And for getting this result, there are two implicit assumptions in the classical labor market. One is perfectly flexible prices and wages. If and only if prices and wages are perfectly flexible, you will get to this result. A second is, it is assumed that all the market participants have full information about market prices. Then only they can make calculations about real wage. And these two assumptions are essential for classical theory of equilibrium level of income and output determination. Fully flexible prices and wages and perfect information from the part of market participants. If these assumptions are violated, as we have seen, if prices and wages are not flexible, also as we will see later, if there is any asymmetry of information, lack of information from the part of market participants, you will not get such a result. And this is the classical theory of employment, income and real wage determination.